To enjoy this episode ad-free, please visit patreon.com/forensictales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
For months, Dorothy Jane Scott received anonymous phone calls from a man who said he was watching her. He knew where she worked. He knew where she went at night. Sometimes he even described the clothes she had worn that day. At first, Dorothy tried to ignore the calls, but they kept coming. Sometimes the caller sounded angry. Other times, almost obsessed. On one occasion, he told her he was going to cut her up into pieces. Dorothy was terrified. She started taking self-defense classes and even considered buying a gun. But whoever was calling always remained anonymous. Then, on the night of May 28, 1980, Dorothy drove a coworker to the hospital after he had been bitten by a spider. After parking her white Toyota station wagon, she went inside with him. A short time later, Dorothy stepped outside to bring the car around to the front entrance. But instead of pulling up to the hospital doors, her car suddenly sped through the parking lot and disappeared into the night. Dorothy Jane Scott was never seen alive again, and in the years that followed, the phone calls didn't stop. This is Forensic Tales, episode 330, The Murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. Orange County, California is known for a lot of things. As someone who's lived here for my entire life, I can honestly say it's the best place in the world. Miles of coastline, quiet suburban neighborhoods, theme parks, shopping centers, and carefully planned communities helped define Southern California living in the 1970s and 80s. For many people, it represented the promise of a comfortable life, safe neighborhoods, good schools, a place to raise a family. But even in places that seem peaceful, violence can hide in plain sight. And sometimes the most frightening threats aren't strangers lurking in the dark, but someone who has been watching you for a very long time. In 1980, a young mother living here in Orange County began receiving anonymous phone calls from a man who claimed he was watching her. At first, she tried to ignore them, but the calls kept coming, and one night, after driving a coworker to the hospital, she stepped outside to bring her car around to the entrance. She was never seen again. Her name was Dorothy Jane Scott. I usually like to start these types of episodes by talking about the victim. I want you to know everything about them, who they were, how did they grow up, what made them unique, because at the center of these types of stories are real victims. They are real people who deserve to have their lives remembered, not just for the way in which they died, but also for the way they lived their lives. They deserve to be remembered for more than just a murder victim. But in some cases, it's difficult to do that. In many cases, there just isn't much publicly available information, and this is one of those cases. Despite the amount of research I do for each and every episode, I wasn't able to uncover much about Dorothy Jane Scott's life before this happened. But here's everything I can share with you. In the spring of 1980, Dorothy was 32 years old and living in Stanton, California, just outside Anaheim. For those unfamiliar with Southern California, that's a place about 25 miles south of downtown Los Angeles. She lived there with her aunt and her 4-year-old son, Sean, while her parents lived nearby in Anaheim and helped care for her child while she worked. Sean's father, Dennis Terry, lived hundreds of miles away in Missouri and wasn't much help raising him. When Dorothy wasn't at home with her son, she was usually at work. She worked as a secretary for two jointly owned stores in Anaheim. The first was Swinger's Psych Shop, and the second was Custom John's Head Shop. The stores sold novelty and counterculture items like strange posters, love beads, and lava lamps. And if you lived through that time, you know just how popular those lava lamps were. In hindsight, it was probably an interesting place to work, and Dorothy likely encountered many strange people who were into psychedelics. The reason I bring that up is that we don't know what role her job may or may not have played in what happened to her. But as we go through the story, I want you to keep these shops in the back of your mind. Also interesting was that Dorothy's father had actually owned one of the shops before selling it to the current owners. Her job there was purely administrative and back office work, so she didn't necessarily work face-to-face with all the customers. Sure, she might have walked around a bit and gotten to know some of them, but her work mostly kept her in the back of the shop. But all of her coworkers really liked her. She was always reliable and just a good person to work with. Dorothy wasn't the type to cause any drama. She just came to work each day, did her job the best she could, then went home for the day. She also wasn't the type to really go out. She would much rather just stay home and be a homebody. She didn't even have a boyfriend. At the time of her disappearance, she was single and spent all of her free time either with her son or at church. Everyone who knew her described her as a devoted Christian. They also said she was quiet, hardworking, a good mom, and very family-oriented. She didn't do drugs or drink alcohol. Her brother, Jim, said, quote, "To me, she exemplified the word give. She'd just give and give and give, no matter what it cost her." Dorothy Jane Scott was, by all accounts, an ordinary woman living a quiet life in Orange County. A devoted mother, a reliable coworker, and someone who mostly kept to herself. There was nothing about her life that suggested she would become the victim of a violent crime. But a few months before she disappeared, something disturbing began happening. She started receiving anonymous phone calls from a man who claimed he was watching her. At first, the calls came to the shops where she worked, and initially, they were just flirty messages. The caller would say things like, "You're the most beautiful woman in the entire world," or "I want to take you out on a date." So it seemed like it might just be a customer who had a little crush on Dorothy, but had a very weird way of going about it. The caller also never gave his name and hung up before she could get any real information from him. But then, the phone calls turned really strange. Not only did Dorothy start receiving them while she was at home, but he also started threatening her instead of flirting with her. He started saying things like, "I know where you live," and "I'm going to come over there tonight and kill you." It didn't take Dorothy long to realize this was a very serious situation. These phone calls went well beyond just a stalker or someone bothering her. On many of these phone calls, the man would describe exactly what she was wearing, as if he was watching her right then and there. He would also describe what she did that day, what time she arrived at work, what time she got home. He knew everything about her daily routines. So it became clear to Dorothy pretty quickly that this person was physically stalking her on top of the annoying phone calls. You can only imagine the fear she must have felt. She's a single mom to a young son. She lives with her aunt. This person knows where she works and what time she gets home at night. It quickly became a very scary thing for Dorothy. But the phone calls didn't stop. They just kept going and getting more and more frightening. On one of these phone calls, the man said he would cut her up into bits so no one would ever find her. In another, the caller told her to go outside because he had left something for her. So she walked out to the parking lot and checked her car. And sitting there on the windshield was a single red rose. But it wasn't fresh, it was dead. And that moment really shook her, because it meant the person calling her wasn't just making random threats over the phone. He was close enough to watch her and to know exactly where she would be. Dorothy later told her mom something else that made the situation even more disturbing. She said the man's voice sounded familiar, like it was someone she knew. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't figure out who it was. And that detail would become incredibly important later, because investigators eventually believed the person responsible for Dorothy's disappearance was likely someone who already knew her. After the Dead Rose incident, Dorothy decided enough was enough. She needed to protect herself and her son. So she researched purchasing a gun. She had never felt the need to own one before until this happened. She just couldn't shake the feeling that this man was going to follow through on his threats. Her own instincts were telling her she needed to protect herself. She also started taking self-defense classes at a local studio. In fact, her first class was just 1 week before she went missing. Something I find incredibly disturbing is just how quickly this man would flip. In one phone call, he would say how much he loved her and wanted to marry her, but in another, he would say she's gonna die. But as it turns out, that behavior is actually very common in stalking cases, especially if the caller thought Dorothy was rejecting him. Unfortunately, the calls didn't stop. And as the spring of 1980 went on, the situation only seemed to get worse. Then, on the night of May 28th, 1980, Dorothy Jane Scott went missing. At around 9 o'clock in the evening on May 28th, 1980, Dorothy and her coworkers were all together at a staff meeting inside one of the shops. But while they're sitting there, Dorothy noticed that one of her coworkers, Conrad Bostron, didn't look too good and had a big red mark on his arm. So she asked him if everything was okay, but Conrad just said he wasn't feeling well. After the staff meeting wrapped up, Dorothy offered to drive Conrad to the hospital. At first, he declined, saying he didn't want to. He said he just wanted to get home, call it a night, and hope he feels better in the morning. But Dorothy was really worried about him. She wasn't 100% sure, but she thought the mark on his arm could be some type of spider bite. And if he wasn't feeling well, that meant it might be something serious that should get looked at. So after a little convincing from Dorothy, he eventually agreed. So after that, Dorothy, Conrad, and another coworker, Pam Head, all drove to the emergency room at UC Irvine Medical Center. But before they got there, they stopped at Dorothy's parents' house to make sure everything was okay with her son, and to see if her parents were willing to watch him for a few more hours. They said yes, like they usually did, and Dorothy then swapped her red scarf for a black one, got back in the car, and headed toward the hospital. By this point, Conrad was feeling even worse, and the red mark on his arm was getting bigger. Dorothy's parents and son didn't know it, but that would be the last time they saw her alive. They arrived at the Irvine Medical Center at around 9:30 that night. Conrad went with the doctors and nurses into the emergency room, and Pam and Dorothy stayed together in the waiting room. Pam would later say that Dorothy never left her side and never gave her any indication that something was wrong. That's an important detail I want you to remember for a little later in the episode. About 90 minutes later, at 11 o'clock, Conrad was discharged. The doctors there quickly determined that he had been bitten by a black widow spider. So that explained why he wasn't feeling well and the red mark on his arm. That also meant Dorothy was right, and it was a good thing they decided to get him checked out. So they gave him a prescription and told him he could go home for the night. If he didn't start feeling better by the morning, he was told to come back. The three of them headed toward the exit, but before they reached the door, Dorothy told Conrad and Pam to wait there so she could get the car. She didn't want him walking all the way to the parking structure because he still wasn't feeling well. That was just the kind of friend she was. Not only did she spend her night waiting in the emergency room, but she also wanted to be as helpful as possible in a stressful situation. So Pam and Conrad went together to fill his prescription at the pharmacy while Dorothy went to get her car, but she never came back. And here's where this story just gets downright chilling. After waiting at the exit for a while, Pam and Conrad decided to walk to the parking lot to see what was taking Dorothy so long. It wasn't that far of a walk, and she should have been back already. Plus, they stopped at the pharmacy, so she should have been parked out front waiting for them. But as they walked toward the parking lot, that's when they saw her white 1973 Toyota station wagon speeding toward them. For a split second, it almost seemed like she was about to ram her car right into them. It was going so fast and the headlights were so bright, they couldn't see who was behind the wheel. They just knew it was Dorothy's car. But then, the car did something even stranger. Despite waving their arms and calling after her, the car just sped past Pam and Conrad and took a sharp right turn out of the parking lot. It was obviously really strange behavior, but initially, the coworkers just thought something might have happened to Dorothy's son, and that's why she had to hightail it out there. It wasn't within her character to do something like that, but they just chalked it up to an emergency and found another ride home. But when Dorothy still wasn't answering her phone a few hours later, the coworkers started to get really worried about her, and then her car was found. At about 4:30 in the morning, just hours after the strange hospital parking lot incident, Dorothy's car was found abandoned and engulfed in flames in an alley in the city of Santa Ana, which was about 10 miles away from the hospital. But only the car was on fire. Dorothy was nowhere to be found, and neither was her purse nor any of her other belongings. It was like someone had just dumped her car there and set it on fire. Later on, arson investigators determined that the fire had originated in the car's passenger seat, suggesting that's where something had happened to Dorothy. Despite this crime occurring in 1980, whoever the suspect was had already planned to destroy evidence. But the people closest to Dorothy had no idea any of this had happened. Back in Stanton, her parents were expecting her to return home sometime that night. Her 4-year-old son was there, waiting for his mom to come back, but Dorothy never showed up. At first, her family wasn't immediately alarmed. They didn't know about the strange incident in the parking lot yet, and just thought the hospital might be taking longer than expected. It wouldn't be entirely uncommon to spend all night waiting in an emergency room waiting room. But as the hours turned into the next day, it was getting harder and harder for the family to ignore this. This was completely out of character for her. She was responsible. She was dependable. She was a devoted mother who would never just disappear without telling someone where she was going. So by the afternoon of May 29th, her family had begun to worry that something was terribly wrong and reported her missing to the police. But before they could even get to work looking for her, the phone rang at Dorothy's parents' house. On the other end of the line was a man, and he had one single question. Is Dorothy home? That was just the beginning of a series of strange phone calls Dorothy's parents would receive. For the next 4 years, they would receive countless phone calls from the same unidentified male caller, presumably the same person who had been calling Dorothy before she vanished. And he seemed to stick to a pretty tight schedule. Every Wednesday morning, he would pick up the phone and call Dorothy's parents' house. It was usually her mom, Vera, who would answer the phone. Sometimes the caller would say he was the one who took Dorothy, and she was safe with him. Other times, he said he had killed her. But no matter what his message was, his delivery was always the same. He was always cool, calm, and collected. He never raised his voice. He never got mad or frustrated. It was like he was just delivering the news to a stranger over the phone. You can only imagine what Dorothy's parents must have gone through getting these phone calls each and every single week. On one hand, they must have been hopeful that maybe their daughter was still alive, being held captive somewhere. They thought they might be able to persuade him to let her go, remind him she was a single mother to a young son. Maybe they even told him they wouldn't turn him in to the police if he just let her go. But on the other hand, they must have been terribly worried that this guy had actually done something to harm her. They knew it was entirely possible that all he was doing at this point was tormenting them, and there was nothing they could do or say to bring Dorothy back. These incredibly disturbing phone calls went on for years, not weeks or months. This man called for about 4 years, and throughout that entire time, Dorothy Jane Scott was nowhere to be found. The only thing her family had was her burned-out car. She never returned home to collect her son. She never clocked in at work again. She was simply gone after speeding away from the hospital that night and abandoning her coworkers. Dorothy's parents did everything they possibly could to try to trace the phone calls. So did the police in Southern California. But in 1980, tracing a phone call wasn't nearly as simple as it would be today. There were no cell phone records, no digital call logs, and no easy way for investigators to instantly track where a call was coming from. In most cases, calls had to remain connected for a certain period before the phone company could even attempt to trace them. And the man calling Dorothy's parents never stayed on the line long enough for that to happen. Whoever was on the other end of that phone clearly knew who Dorothy was. But the real question investigators began asking was this: how well did he know her? Immunity is something I used to take for granted until I kept getting sick at the worst times. Most people only think about their immune system when it fails, but by then, you've already missed the window to get ahead of it. Your immune system isn't just about whether you get a cold. It's the system that decides how fast you recover, how well you fight off infection, how your body regulates itself under stress. And it is incredibly sensitive to what's happening in your blood. 3 markers that tell a powerful story about immune function. Vitamin D, which plays a direct regulatory role in immune response. Deficiency is one of the most common and correctable reasons people get sick more often. Zinc, which is essential for building and activating immune cells, and is frequently depleted by stress and poor diet. And HSCRP, because chronic inflammation suppresses immune efficiency over time. I use this, and you should too. Check your health the way I do. 160 plus lab tests a year for $365, plus the ability to dive deeper into your results with Function's trusted connections to platforms you already use like ChatGPT and Claude. Join at www.functionhealth.com/TALES or use gift code TALES25 for a $25 credit toward your membership. Trying to figure out how to get the right mental health treatment for you can feel overwhelming. Talkiatry helps you move from "I know I need help" to actually having a psychiatrist who listens and a clear, personalized treatment plan. It's a 100% online psychiatry practice that provides comprehensive evaluations, diagnoses, and ongoing medication management for conditions like ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD, insomnia, and more. All 800 plus clinicians are in network with major insurers, so you can use your existing insurance instead of paying monthly subscriptions or out-of-network costs. Head to talkiatry.com/tales and complete the short assessment to get matched with an in-network psychiatrist in just a few minutes. That's talkiatry.com/tales to get matched in minutes. About 2 weeks after Dorothy went missing, the Orange County Register printed a story about her disappearance and offered a $25,000 reward for any information. Orange County isn't exactly a place where young single mothers go missing, so her disappearance was a pretty big deal for the area. But the same day the article was published, A man called the paper's editorial office and told a managing editor, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." What's odd about that is Dorothy didn't even have a boyfriend at the time she disappeared. But it has to make you wonder whether the guy thought that her coworker, Conrad, the one she drove to the hospital that night, was someone she was seeing. So when the guy saw Conrad, he got jealous and attacked. But it wasn't just the caller's words that made the editor get goosebumps. The caller also seemed to know details about Dorothy's case that had never been made public. He knew about Conrad's spider bite. He knew about the red scarf that Dorothy wore the night she vanished. He also claimed that Dorothy had called him while she and her coworkers were at the emergency room, a detail that was later disputed by Pam Head, who said Dorothy never made any phone calls that night. She was with her the entire night in the waiting room and said Dorothy never left her side or made any phone calls. But it was those details that made everyone wonder just how close this caller was to Dorothy. He gave details that only someone very close to her disappearance would know. It just had to be someone involved, whether he was the one who actually took her or was somehow involved. There was just no way he would know certain details that were never made public. For months after that article was published, the police tried to track down the caller's identity, but they were not able to do so. They really believed the same person was responsible for all the phone calls, but they never had a name, address, or motive to identify them. And for years, Dorothy's parents lived with that haunting reminder that someone out there knew exactly what had happened to their daughter. Then, in April of 1984, 4 years later, the phone rang again one evening. It was Dorothy's dad, Jacob, who answered that time. On the other end of the line was the same man who had been calling for years. But this time would be different, because after that call, the phone calls suddenly stopped. On August 6, 1984, more than 4 years after Dorothy vanished, a construction worker near Santa Ana Canyon Road in Anaheim Hills came across something no one expected to find. While preparing to lay telephone cables, a subcontractor working for Pacific Bell uncovered partially buried human bones lying about 30 feet off the road. Right nearby were also the remains of a dog. The area was remote and rugged, and investigators later learned that a brush fire had swept through it in 1982, likely contributing to the condition of the remains. About a week later, on August 14th, authorities were finally able to identify the remains. Using dental records, investigators confirmed that the bones belonged to Dorothy Jane Scott. The watch on her wrist had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May 29, 1980, just an hour after she was last seen. Teeth are incredibly durable, and dental records can often be matched even when very little else remains. In this case, they only had her skull, a pelvis, 2 femurs, and an arm. But unfortunately, that's where the forensic answers in this case mostly stopped. Because of the condition of the remains and the fact that they had been exposed to the elements for more than 4 years, investigators were unable to determine Dorothy's exact cause of death. Had she been strangled? We don't know. Sexually assaulted? Again, we don't know. Without a cause of death, it's impossible to know exactly what happened to her. All we know is that she didn't set her car on fire, and she didn't end up in Anaheim Hills in that field on her own. We also know that the motive wasn't robbery because she was still wearing all her jewelry. Someone intentionally did this to her, and that someone was likely the person who had been stalking her and harassing her parents. And unfortunately, the remains weren't the only place where potential evidence had been lost. Remember, just hours after Dorothy disappeared, her car had been discovered burning in an alley in Santa Ana. By the time firefighters arrived, the vehicle had already been heavily damaged by the flames. And fires are one of the most destructive things to a crime scene. Heat can destroy fingerprints, DNA, fibers, and other trace evidence that might have helped investigators understand what happened inside that car. So between the burned vehicle and the condition of the remains, investigators were left with very little physical evidence to work with. And that made solving Dorothy Jane Scott's murder incredibly difficult. About a week after Dorothy's body was identified, her family finally got the opportunity to hold a memorial service for her. For 4 long years, they held out hope that the caller was right. Maybe she was still alive, and he was just holding her captive somewhere. But the discovery of the remains squashed all hope of that happening. It only gave them an opportunity to finally lay her to rest and get a small amount of closure, if that's ever really possible in these types of cases. So on August 22nd, 1984, her funeral was held, where her brother, Jim Scott, delivered a heartfelt eulogy, emphasizing her selflessness and the love she had for others. Dorothy's death also meant that her son, Sean, would have to grow up without a mother, which was incredibly sad because she was all he had. The funeral service might have been an opportunity for her family to say their official goodbyes, but it wasn't the end of the story. They never stopped searching for the truth. They spent years upon years trying to identify the mystery caller, the man everyone believes was responsible for her murder. Sadly, Dorothy's father, Jacob, passed away without ever knowing who took his daughter. The police also didn't stop. Ever since Dorothy went missing, they explored every possible angle. They interviewed all of her coworkers at the 2 shops where she worked. They also spoke with the shop's regular customers who knew Dorothy well. They interviewed ex-boyfriends, including the father of her 4-year-old son. At first, he seemed like a good suspect, especially after the police learned that he and Dorothy had gotten into a fight over their custody arrangement. But he was traveling all the way to Missouri when Dorothy was kidnapped, so there was no way he could have been involved. He even provided detectives with receipts for the trip, and witnesses confirmed seeing him getting on and off the bus. They also spoke to one of Dorothy's acquaintances, who was said to be infatuated with her and worked at an auto body shop across the street from her work. When police questioned him, he apparently confessed that he wanted to marry her, which was a pretty strong statement for someone who was only described as an acquaintance. But the police never found any evidence of his involvement, and he was never questioned further or arrested. Finally, there was Dorothy's boss, John Kikola. Something interesting that you should know about him is that in 1996, a federal court indicted Kikola for tax evasion. What makes this interesting is that some people speculate that Dorothy might have known something about the shop's financials that she shouldn't have. We know she worked in the shop's back office, handling administrative tasks. So that theory seems to make sense to some people. But as far as what I learned during my research, he's never been considered a credible suspect. For years, the police interviewed everyone who had a connection to Dorothy, no matter how small or distant. But none of these interviews ever led anywhere significant, which is incredibly frustrating because most people believe the killer had to be someone Dorothy knew. This person had clearly stalked her for months leading up to her disappearance. So it had to be someone she knew, even if only an acquaintance. But there's never been a single arrest. There are also still so many unanswered questions about the night Dorothy disappeared from that hospital parking lot. Something about that just doesn't add up. We know she left her coworkers for only a few minutes to get the car. She didn't want Conrad walking all the way when he still wasn't feeling good. So that means something happened to her during that short walk to her car. That suggests to me that this was likely just a crime of opportunity. We already knew this guy had been stalking Dorothy, so maybe he just followed her to the hospital like he always did. But when he saw that she was walking alone, he used that moment to engage her. This happened at around 11 o'clock at night, so the parking lot was probably dark, which meant there weren't many witnesses. He probably didn't intend to do anything to her that night, but the opportunity just presented itself, and he took full advantage. What's also incredibly strange is that her coworkers saw her car speed past them, but because of the headlights, they couldn't tell who was driving. So this suggests that maybe Dorothy wasn't the one behind the wheel. It's possible that she was in the back seat, passenger side, or even the trunk, while her abductor was the one driving. We know that the fire inside her car originated on the passenger seat, so maybe that's where she was. Or maybe that's where he sat and set the fire to get rid of any trace evidence that could be linked back to him. It's also possible that someone was forcing her to drive and told her to go as quickly as possible. That lines up with the coworker's story that the car accelerated toward them before making a sharp right-hand turn out of the parking lot. These are all the questions I have in the back of my mind. Was Dorothy actually driving? Was someone forcing her to drive? Was someone else already in the car? What exactly happened in that hospital parking lot? But I think one thing is obvious. Whoever killed Dorothy had followed her to the hospital that night. They knew she would be there and waited for the perfect opportunity to grab her when she was alone. This is just one of the most chilling stalking cases we've ever covered on this show. When it comes to suspects, there are several possible theories, but as I mentioned earlier, there have never been any arrests. The first is something I've already talked about. The suspect could have been a coworker or customer at one of the shops where Dorothy worked. This theory checks off a lot of boxes. As a coworker or regular customer, they would have known her routine. They would have known where she worked, what her schedule looked like, and they would have had easy access to call the shop and speak with her. Another theory is that it could have been someone from her church. Dorothy was known to be a devoted Christian who rarely missed a Sunday service. Most people who knew her said she would much rather be at church than anywhere else. So could the suspect have been someone from that part of her life? Or could it have been a rejected admirer? That theory actually fits very well with the pattern of the phone calls. Remember, the calls didn't start out threatening. At first, they were almost flirtatious. The man said he loved her. He talked about wanting to marry her. But when Dorothy didn't respond the way he wanted, the tone suddenly shifted to threats and violence. Something that really supports the idea that this was someone close to Dorothy is the Dead Rose incident. If you recall from earlier in the episode, the caller once told Dorothy to go outside because he had left something for her. When she did, she found a dead rose sitting on her car. That moment tells us something very important. Whoever was calling Dorothy had to be physically nearby. He wasn't just calling from some random location. He was close enough to watch her, close enough to know when she walked outside, and possibly even close enough to see her reaction when she found the rose. That suggests this likely wasn't a random stranger. Whoever was calling Dorothy seemed to know details about her daily life and routine. And that strongly suggests the suspect was someone she knew, even if only casually. But one of the most chilling parts of this entire story is what happened after Dorothy disappeared. The phone calls to her parents. For 4 years, the man continued calling their home and asking the same question. Is Dorothy home? And what makes those calls so disturbing is that the caller clearly understood the risk he was taking. Any one of those calls could have potentially been traced. Yet, he continued making them anyway. It almost seems like he couldn't help himself. And then, there's another strange detail. The calls suddenly stopped right after Dorothy's remains were discovered in 1984. After that moment, the caller was never heard from again, which raises even more questions. Why keep calling for 4 years? Dorothy was already gone, so why continue calling her parents and asking if she was home? Was he reliving the crime? Was it some kind of twisted power move? Or was it simply part of his obsession? The pattern of these calls actually lines up very closely with what researchers today describe as fixation-based stalking. In these types of cases, the perpetrator becomes intensely fixated on the victim. They may believe they have some kind of destined relationship with that person. And when that imagined relationship is rejected, the behavior can escalate into threats, stalking, and violence. And in many ways, that seems to describe exactly what Dorothy experienced. The constant calls gave him her attention. They gave him control over her life. And even after she disappeared, he maintained that control by continuing to call her family. Over the years, there has been speculation that Dorothy's case might be connected to another disappearance, Patricia Jean Schneider. On the night of July 31st, 1982, Patricia completed her shift as a cocktail waitress at Palomino Station in Indiana Hills, California. At 3:45 in the morning, she made a call from a Circle K in Pedley and said that her car had broken down. She was never seen or heard from again. Between 5 and 6 that morning, a sheriff's deputy found her Toyota Celica on fire in a field near the intersection of Van Buren Boulevard and Doolittle Avenue. But Patricia was nowhere to be found. And arson investigators later determined that the fire was intentionally started. So in both cases, you've got a missing young female whose car was intentionally set on fire relatively quickly after her disappearance. That's led many people to wonder, could the same person be responsible? Is the killer still out there somewhere? As of today, Patricia's case is still unsolved. The only clue we have is that the Circle K clerk noticed 2 sandy-haired Caucasian males in the parking lot around the time Patricia vanished. But other than that, we have no idea what happened to her or who took her. In 1982, she was 25 years old, weighed 115 pounds, and had blonde hair and blue eyes. If this crime had happened today, the outcome might have been very different. Investigators today have tools that simply didn't exist in 1980. Phone calls can be traced almost instantly. Cell phone tower data can place someone in a specific area. Surveillance cameras are everywhere. Vehicles often have GPS tracking built into them. And then there's DNA. Even though fire destroyed much of the potential evidence in Dorothy's car and the remains were exposed to the elements for years, modern forensic technology can sometimes recover genetic material from incredibly small or degraded samples. Investigators today also use tools like geographic profiling, behavioral analysis, and national offender databases, all things that could potentially help narrow down the suspect pool. But unfortunately, none of those tools were available when Dorothy Jane Scott disappeared. And because of that, the identity of the person who stalked her, abducted her, and ultimately murdered her remains unknown. That brings me to my final question. Is this case solvable? My opinion is yes. I think this is still a solvable case. DNA testing wasn't used in 1980, but fingerprinting was, and blood samples were taken at the time. And according to police in Orange County, the location where Dorothy's body had been dumped is still important to this case because it suggests the killer was familiar with the area. They knew it would be a good place to dump a body. It wasn't the kind of place you just stumble upon. So that tells the police they're looking for someone local to Orange County. There's also the possibility that the car could still yield valuable evidence. A fire can destroy a lot, but it doesn't destroy everything. According to the Orange County Sheriff's Office, the vehicle is still in the possession of the Santa Ana Police Department. Finally, there is Dorothy's inner circle. It just takes one person with information to finally come forward. This doesn't have to be a cold case forever. It just takes one person to finally speak up. There are lots of cases where people just didn't recognize the signs of who was probably the stalker. Dr. Chris Kunkel, a forensic and clinical psychologist and co-founder of the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College, said in an interview, "In Dorothy's case, I think he was seemingly close enough that people knew him but didn't know what he was doing." More than 4 decades have now passed since Dorothy Jane Scott disappeared from that hospital parking lot in Orange County. In that time, forensic science has changed dramatically. Investigators today have tools that simply didn't exist in 1980. But in Dorothy's case, those tools came too late. Whoever that caller was spent months stalking her, watching her, calling her, threatening her, and even after she was gone, he couldn't stop reaching out to the people who loved her most. Today, Dorothy Jane Scott's murder remains unsolved. And even after all these years, one question still lingers. If Dorothy were somehow able to answer that phone today, would she know the voice on the other end? Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. Thank you so much to this week's newest supporter, Maida F. You can learn more at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.